Hi there, Jonathan here. The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website where you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. That's at www.jonathanfoust.com. Thank you and enjoy. So tonight's talk is on the seventh of the 10 perfections, on honesty and truthfulness. So I'd like to start with a story, as I often do, and I need to acknowledge I blatantly ripped this one off my wife. It's a story of a young guy during the summer. He's working at a little corner supermarket, and someone comes and asks for half a head of lettuce. He says, well, let me check with my manager. So he sees his manager. He said, hey, some moron wants half a head of lettuce. And he looks over, and the guy's standing right behind him. He says, and this fine gentleman would like to buy the other half. Later, the supervisor says, young man, I really appreciate how fast you are on your feet. That was really impressive. And he said, well, thank you very much. I think that guy was from Canada. And as you know, there are only hookers and hockey players from Canada. And the manager stiffens up and says, hey, my wife is from Canada. And the young man says, so what team does she play for? So, honesty and truthfulness. First, I'd like to review again these qualities of the 10 perfections. These are described as different aspects of your nature that when you pay attention to them and you kind of bring them into alignment, they really reflect on your inherent goodness. And I thought an interesting way to reflect on it might be to do it as a short little reflection. So if you like, you can close your eyes. And you might just reflect on these qualities as you feel the breath. Just to reflect on the quality of generosity, of what it means to be generous, to give of yourself, and to sense what generosity feels like on the inside. The second of the 10 perfections is where your ethical conduct is truly aligned with your heart. There's qualities of non-harming, of service, social justice, and creating a better world for all. The third quality is described as renunciation, or what it means to let go of everything you don't need in this life, where you are living from a place of simplicity and an inner place of ease. And what follows when you simplify your life is that you begin to cultivate wisdom, a capacity to see what is true. And as you cultivate this capacity to see clearly into the nature of reality, you call on vitality and vigor and energy to live your life fully. And as you live your life fully with vigor and enthusiasm, you also develop a quality of acceptance, a quality of tolerance, a quality of endurance for this life's journey you're living. And as you do so, you then call upon these qualities of honesty, of truthfulness. So, if you like, you can deepen the breath. There are a few things I'd like to touch on tonight with some reflections. One is about the path, this path each one of us is walking. The first has to do with looking for what's true. And the second is about recognizing truth when you come across it. The third is about attuning to truth no matter where you are. And the fourth has to do about speaking the truth. So as we step off on our journey in life, something calls us to practice or to see more clearly or to move from what we think is true to find out what is really true. And so we start off and we experiment. And I heard about this guy and I wanted to look him up. In 2008, this guy named Thomas Thwaites, you may have heard about him, he decided to build a toaster from scratch, to make all the materials himself. So he went to a store and he bought the cheapest toaster he could find, thinking that it would be the easiest to replicate. And he discovered that in this one cheap toaster, like a $8 toaster or a $10 toaster, there were 400 parts with over 100 different materials that went into making this toaster. And his decision was he was going to make all those parts by hand. But he decided that he would focus on the bare materials that he needed, which was steel, mica, plastic, copper, and nickel. And so he did everything himself. He found all the raw materials, he smelted them, and it was a 9-month project. And finally, when he kind of put this contraption together, there was no insulation, so after he plugged it down, it all melted down in 5 seconds. But there's great videos of him like building these smelters using a leaf blower, from the iron ore that he dug up and so forth. But what I love about that story is it kind of speaks to the spiritual journey. We're kind of doing it ourselves. You're trying, I'm sure, if we were to compare all the books we've read, all the practices we've tried, all the traditions we've looked at, they're all part of this exploration to discover who and what you truly are. And we've all tried all kinds of different things, I'm sure. And having sort of had that sort of burning urge from a young age and, living in an ashram for 25 years, I've been kind of surrounded by maniacs looking for, this is it, It's amazing when I reflect back on all those who have practiced, it's like, oh, yoga is it. Drugs are it. Sex is it. Rock and roll is it. Maybe better sex than I had last time is it. Then this spiritual tradition is it. No, this one is. No, this book is it. Raw foods, that's it. Astrology, Tony Robbins, that's it. This form of meditation is it. That form of meditation is it. All we can do is practice and evaluate. What the Buddha said is that, and part of the hardcore teaching is that no one's going to save you. that you have to take responsibility for your own awakening, if you will. So all you can do is to practice with sincerity and then evaluate, was this practice more wholesome or less wholesome for me? That's all you've got. There's a phrase that says, finding your dharma is your dharma. Finding your path is your path. And it's very, very important that you find the path that most resonates for you. Through yoga philosophy, we talk about 4 fundamental paths toward union or toward yoga. One is the path of devotion. That's cultivating love for the divine. It's about like merging with the divine through the heart. So there are devotional paths. You could say that the Catholic, tradition is a pretty devotional path. There are many, many different expressions of those devotional paths. But for some people, that is a direct path. You just open your heart, you merge with the divine, and you have that sense of deep, deep union and deep connection. For some of us, there's the path, so that's referred to as bhakti yoga, or the yoga of devotion. Then there's what's called jnana yoga, which is the path of the intellect. And that is clearly discerning what is real and what is not real. It's about self-study. So people who are drawn to that particular path find reading books to be really, really powerful. Or like going to source material and reading about it, or taking questions and contemplating them. The whole practice of the koan, for example, where you're sort of like blowing the mind through the mind. So that's a whole path. That's very, very powerful and direct for some people. For other people, it's the path of action, the path of service. So the path of karma yoga is all about cause and effect. So these are for people who find making their way in the world through action to be the most fulfilling. And exploring selflessness in service. Can you serve others and release a tightly bound sense of self? Direct path. The other path is sort of the path of self-discipline, the path of Raja Yoga, where you're purifying the body, you're purifying the mind, you're purifying kind of presence through discipline and rigor. For some of us, we really resonate with certain traditions. The ashram I lived in happened to be a very devotional path. And I'm not such a devotional guy. I tried really hard, but it just didn't quite resonate for me. I was more interested in meditation and more in like direct experience, and a little bit more of the intellectual approach is what resonated for me. But also the karma yoga piece, the act of service was part of what resonated for me. But again, the Buddha said your path is to find your path and then give yourself to it fully. So the search for truth is very, very important. And if a path, as Carlos Castaneda said, the way to ascertain a path is to ask yourself, does this path have heart? Does this path resonate with your heart? If it doesn't, it's useless. So the search is so important. So life, of course, gives you plenty of opportunities to explore what's true. And you can reject all traditions to find your own path, but you can also look toward those who have walked this path before you to see what they have to say. That can be quite helpful. And part of the reason why life is such a powerful teacher is because it brings you right face to face with your own stress and with your own suffering. And looking at that stress and suffering becomes a very powerful doorway. The first of the noble truths is that stress and suffering are part of life. The second, there is a cause for your stress and your suffering. And it's tied into attachment, to clinging, to identification. So looking at stress and suffering can be very, very helpful. I've shared before the 4 magic words that can make a happy person sad and a sad person happy. This too shall pass. Whenever you find yourself caught in struggle, to remember that it's going to change can really ease the heart and ease the soul. And when you're in those peak experiences, when you think you've arrived and you've got it, it's very helpful to remember that this too is going to change. When you can practice that, there can be a quality of steadiness through your life, which is really referred to as the fruit of the practice, that steadiness in the face of everything that fluctuates in your life. So, impermanence seems to be a really key element of truth. The Buddha spoke of the 3 characteristics of reality. And again, whenever he offered this teaching, he would always say, don't believe a word of what I'm telling you. You have to verify this for yourself. But if you look closely at the moment-to-moment manifestation of your life, you may notice characteristic number 1, impermanence. That anything conditioned is going to change. And the second characteristic of reality has to do with the stress and suffering you experience in relationship to what is changing. If you are resisting something changing or you're wanting something to change and it isn't, to that degree you will suffer. If you can let it change, there's no suffering. And the third characteristic of reality has to do with the nature of who you are. That you are a conditioned being. You're in a body which is going to change. You have this personality which is going to change. And there's something about you that is unchanging. There is some quality of you that is unconditioned. So reflecting and remembering these 3 characteristics have been tremendously helpful for me when I remember, which is not that often. To remember that everything changes. To remember that any complaint that I have in life is all about relationship to something that's changing. And to remember that I'm a conditioned being. I'm the product of conditioning. And at the same time, there is something unconditioned. And we all know this. We've all touched it at different times. So a short reflection, if you will. A little Zen pop quiz. You can close your eyes. And you might deepen your breath, just to slow down your breath. And you might bring into mind something that's been kind of something problematic, some little glitch in the matrix that you've been experiencing recently. You might take a moment to kind of call it forward, bring it a little bit closer. Might be helpful to visualize it, to sense what it feels like inside. And you might just sense this issue through this filter of impermanence. Noticing how it's changing. how it might change. You might take a moment to reflect on the stress or the quality of suffering that you have about this. Where is the holding? Where is the resistance? You might reflect on how this issue is held in your own conditioning. If you could let it go, what would that feel like? What would that be like? So as you're ready, you can deepen your breath. And you can open your eyes. So at any point, in any situation, we can ask ourselves, what's true? What's the truth here? The opposite of truth is delusion. And delusion is believing something is true that isn't, or believing something isn't true that is. So the desire to see what's true is a powerful force. It can be humiliating, but it can also be liberating. So, as we're navigating through life, inevitably we come in contact with different forms of stress and suffering. And that question of what is true can be very, very helpful. Tara and I were leading a retreat, a day-long retreat on conscious relationships this weekend, and one of the elements in relationship, with it being Father's Day, reminded me of a situation with my father as he was getting older with dementia and going into Alzheimer's. For a while it was relatively easy. He had a good sense of humor, and then it got harder and harder, and it became more and more difficult for me to know how to be with him, because he was very erratic, and was really not able to keep anything linear going anymore. And so I had a huge amount of stress and anxiety about visiting him. And then I realized, wait a minute, I can do a role reversal here. And I find this to be a really powerful way to kind of tune in to what's true. And the role reversal is simply your capacity to exchange your role for the other. So I asked myself, how does my father want me to be with him? And pretty quickly, I realized he just wants company. He doesn't want me to entertain him. He doesn't want me to engage him. He doesn't want me to stimulate him. He doesn't want me to try and get him to talk. He just wants company. And the relief that I felt from that was quite palpable. And it really shifted the way I was with him through the rest of his time. When we're hurt, we get small, and we calcify, and we self-protect. And when we begin to try to open our hearts to those who have harmed us, we have to let go of our story and open up to a bigger story. A story that I've shared before, but just to kind of summarize it once, where I was having a lot of trouble with someone who I felt had betrayed me. who had kind of like threw me under the bus at one point. And it really hurt. And as I sat with it over a long period of time with the intention to try to forgive, I suddenly was able to move into this role reversal. It just sort of happened, mostly because I was really sick of the pain that I was feeling, to be honest. And because I got quiet enough. And I realized that how afraid he was. He was afraid of losing his job. And so he told some untruth to people kind of behind my back that successfully preserved his job and jeopardized mine. I still felt betrayed, but I had a deeper sense of understanding. And once I had that sense of understanding, as the Buddha said, understanding leads to forgiveness. So that capacity to shift from my story to sense another person's point of view can open up a much deeper sense of what is true. So another brief little reflection, if you like. You can close your eyes. And if you like, you might bring into mind just some problematic relationship. Just somewhere where you might have a little stress or a little disappointment. You might take a few breaths and again to draw this person a little closer. And first, just a sense, what are your feelings? What do you feel from your point of view? If you could find a word or two that describes the emotion you might be feeling. Is there a sense of your unmet need? What are you wanting that's not happening? And if you could imagine a role reversal, if you could just sort of temporarily move into this person's body, what do you imagine they're feeling? Is there an emotional word that comes to mind? And is there a sense of their unmet need? A sense of what they're wanting, what they're hoping for that isn't happening or didn't happen? And if that need was met, how do you imagine they might feel? And just noticing what you might take from this little reflection. And then when you're ready, you can deepen your breath. And if you like, you can open your eyes, or you can remain with them closed if you prefer. The desire to know what's true has to be a strong desire, because it requires that you move from your point of view. You move from your perception of what is true to something greater. It's a transformational inquiry. Of course, there's a whole question in our society: what is true? What is happening now? And again, it's very, very hard to see so clearly about the inherent racism in our culture right now. The suppression of the non-dominant groups in this culture. The global warming or the global weirding. Those who are able to see it clearly, and those in our culture now who are not, who are choosing to believe something different about it. In an era of fake news, we have to really slow down to ascertain what is really true, rather than just the first knee-jerk reaction to what we hear. So if you want the truth, you have to really attune to it. You have to really want it. And it's interesting how in different spiritual traditions, there are some traditions that are all about truth. And there's some great truth teachers out there. Their whole thing is, I'm going to tell you the truth and you deal with it. Then there are other traditions that are all about compassion. And that approach is to, I'm going to be gentle and I'm going to be supportive. And as you get less and less defended, you'll be able to see the truth for yourself. And I think there's kind of a balance in there. And part of the balance is how you communicate truth. There's a good checklist that I find very helpful that falls into the category of wise speech. And we'll kind of end with this. But first, just a quick little story. A CEO friend of mine had to fire someone. His board demanded that this person had to go. The problem for him, he was a new CEO, the problem was that this was a personal friend of his. He brought him on, he coached him up, he supported him, and really wanted to grow him into this role. And his friend had a family, he was already insecure about the job. He kind of knew he was in over his head. And he just didn't quite have the chops to meet this position, which required a lot of aggression. And my friend was really ripped up about having to fire his friend. And he didn't know about these criteria for wise speech, but he found his way to them in his own way. And part of when you want to communicate, there are a couple of things you can ask yourself. Is what I'm about to say true? But it's more than just true. Is what I'm about to say kind? Is what I'm about to say helpful? Is what I'm about to say timely? And is what I'm about to say something the other person can hear? So he agonized over this, but then he had to have this meeting. And what was true was he was being fired. He couldn't get around that. How could he speak kindly? He was able to say to his friend, I acknowledge what you've done, and I see how hard you've worked. Is what he could say helpful? And he said, well, I let him know I was going to do everything I could to help him find a new job, to help him get a good, fresh, new start. The question, can he hear it? He thought, well, he's going to have to hear it. He doesn't have any choice here. But then the question, is what I'm about to say timely? And that one he reflected on. And what he realized was that he didn't want his friend to get particularly embarrassed about his reaction. So what he ended up saying to his friend, and he actually coached me really well on how to fire people when it was my turn to do that. He said, your position here isn't working out. I want you to know that you've worked really hard and you've given it your all, but it's just not a match for where we need to go as an organization. I want to help you figure out what's next. But what would be best right now is you take the afternoon and this weekend to think about your transition and what's next. And and I want to meet with you on Monday so we can talk about your transition. So for him, really realize was timely was to just offer the message and let his friend have his own process, his own reaction, and sort of give him the to honor him in his own reactivity, to let him do what he needed to do. And actually that formula, there was a time when I was running a large organization and had to let a lot of people go that really worked really, really well. Just to kind of like to reflect on those questions, to help to craft a communication that has a balance of truth with some compassion. So maybe just again a little short reflection if you want to try this one on. You might again bring into mind maybe a relationship where you're having some difficulty communicating. And I'll just offer these questions and you can take a little bit of time to reflect on them. What would you say to this person that reflects the truth? What could you say that would be kind? What could you say that would be helpful? Is there a sense of the timing? What would the best timing be for a communication? And the final inquiry is, can this person hear it? Or how might you put it in such a way that they could hear what you have to say? And you might imagine this communication, how it might be received if you do a little role reversal. And when you're ready, you can deepen the breath. And again, you can let your eyes open. So, this particular perfection, if you will, this quality to polish in your life, in the context of the 10 perfections, is to reflect on your own passion for truth, to know what is true. And part of what that requires is a rigor to explore what is your path. What is your path of heart that most directly awakens you? And as you navigate through life, to stop and ask yourself, what do I know to be true? It can be helpful to reflect from time to time when you're caught on these 3 characteristics of reality, to remember that all conditioned things change. So if you're low, it's going to change. If you're at the top of the wave, it's going to change. That can result in a quality of steadiness. And to reflect on this characteristic of suffering. To remember that suffering is always the result of some form of identification or clinging or attachment. That as you navigate through life, to remember that you are a product of conditions. And you have this deep, innate capacity to let go. That this sense of freedom is just a breath away. Relationally, it can be very helpful to pause and do a role reversal. Simply to ask, what is this other person feeling? What is this other person needing? That can be a very powerful way to open from just your point of view to a greater sense of what may be true in a much broader area. And when it comes to speech, which is really where the rubber hits the road, is it possible to balance out speaking truth with compassion, where it might be helpful to be aware of what the other person can hear? These are some of the qualities that can be helpful in navigating this amazing and ridiculous journey that we're on together. Thanks for your kind attention. A couple quick announcements. Just to let you know that there is an event happening Wednesday night. It is the transmissions ceremony.